Well, as I mentioned earlier, the self-isolation of the Prime Minister and his wife over COVID-19 concerns led to the indefinite postponement of the First Minister's meeting with Indigenous leaders that was supposed to take place tonight here in Ottawa. My next guest was to have been in the room for that meeting. Natan Obed is the president of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, representing 65,000 Inuit in communities across Canada's north. Good to see you again. Thanks for coming in to speak with me. How did you find out the meeting was being cancelled?
We got an email about 2 minutes before the announcement was made publicly, so it was a surprise to us, like it was a surprise, I think, to everyone.
Right. So, and I guess you understand why, and it makes sense, I suppose, for gatherings like this. Was there any discussion about the possibility of trying to do the meeting over the phone, as I think the First Ministers are going to try and do?
From the latest information that I have, there will be a National Indigenous Organization meeting with the Prime Minister by phone tomorrow.
Okay.
We're still in conversation about whether or not there'll be also a segment with provincial and territorial premiers, in addition to the NIO Prime Minister meeting.
Okay, so we'll see where that goes. Now, I know the COVID-19 outbreak was going to be discussed, and what are the particular concerns you have and you would have raised with this group, and may still, but the concerns you have about the way this is evolving and the possible threat to your communities?
Well, there are 51 communities in Inuit Nunangat, our homeland, and all of them share very similar characteristics, especially in relation to healthcare delivery. We depend heavily on service agreements with care facilities in Yellowknife, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Ottawa, also in Montreal and St. John's. So the arrangements that we have for care are essential to the overarching care that Inuit receive on any given day. So in the face of a pandemic and also the concerns that any one jurisdiction might have in and of itself to serve its own population, we were going to bring up the conversation about the need to ensure that the medical access lines are not broken for Inuit in the face of southern jurisdictions.
Give us a better understanding of the particular challenges if you get an outbreak like this sweeping through an isolated community in sometimes difficult conditions. What are the challenges?
Virtually all of our goods and services, especially perishable items and food, are brought in by air. And virtually all of our serious medical considerations that our patients are then flown from those isolated communities to southern centers for care. So it's not as easy as isolating communities based on the fact that we are remote, because a lot of the care that happens in southern centers. Also, we have huge challenges in relation to housing. We have 54% overcrowding in our housing in relation to 5% of the Canadian population. So the public health messaging around things like self-isolation based on exposure to something like COVID-19, those measures don't necessarily work easily within our communities.
Right. What are some of the other priorities that you had hoped to raise, and you might still get a chance to do that, certainly with the Prime Minister, but maybe with the premiers as well?
We were hoping to raise items that have a shared concern across this country. Infrastructure was the first point that we were going to raise, and the necessary investments needed to ensure that the infrastructure gap is closed between Inuit and Nunangat communities and the rest of Canada. Air, marine, and social, basically, especially in relation to housing. We also were going to talk about legislative priorities, the UNDRIP legislation that's been promised for tabling by this Liberal government, also the implementation of what's being called C92, the Act regarding First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children. And then we also were going to talk about the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry and the final report and the calls for justice, and how it truly was a national inquiry and then requires a truly national response.
Let me ask you let's focus a little bit on UNDRIP, United Nations Resolution on the Rights of Indigenous People. There's certainly some pushback in some provinces to that, and we've just gone through a tumultuous season here of blockades and protests, and that might have the effect of raising walls in provinces instead of you're trying to get those walls down, have them to agree to this. So, what's your message around that? How do you say, look, you need to push ahead with UNDRIP, even in the face of what you see in blockades and protests that maybe you don't like?
Well, those blockades and protests and challenges are really the result of 150 years of different ways of considering Indigenous people's rights or not considering them at all, and then different legislation and policies that govern Indigenous peoples in vastly different ways across the country. But in the UNDRIP case, really, UNDRIP is the collection of existing human rights that Indigenous peoples have in the world, globally. It is, UNDRIP did not create a new standard for Indigenous people's rights. It just coalesced around the existing rights that Indigenous people have as human beings. So to couch it as a fear-based considerations for adopting UNDRIP in this country is really what essentially becomes a fear about respecting and implementing our human rights as Indigenous people.
One of the pillars of UNDRIP is, of course, the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples on any decisions that affect development on their lands, resources on their lands. And for some people say, okay, that's a veto. How do you view it?
The term veto is a casual term that's used in the narrative. We look at our modern treaties, our land claim agreements, and Inuit have signed modern treaties that cover over a third of Canada's landmass. And the free, prior, and informed consent mechanisms exist within the provisions of these land claim agreements. So Inuit have already worked with the federal government and now with the provinces and territories in which these agreements are implemented within to create certainty, to exercise our rights, and that also fall within the parameters of the United Nations Declaration.
Fair enough, but does it ultimately mean a veto? I mean, that's for most people concerned about this, or who oppose it. Let's be frank, some people flat out oppose it. The concern is, okay, this provides a veto over any resource development, and is that how you see it? Ultimately, is that what it does?
There are a number of different Supreme Court cases that have already weighed in on free, prior, and informed consent. There also are a number of different agreements that this country, whether it be at the national level or the provincial or territorial level, have with specific First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I think that we need to get away from the alarmist, reductionist conversation about this. If we pursue UNDRIP implementation in this country, we are therefore giving Indigenous peoples all the reins for everything, and that's it. At the same time, the respect for Indigenous people's rights is at the center of all of this, and I think if that guides the conversation, this can be something that falls in line with the other considerations that any project proponent has with any different natural resource extraction project.
It would be your view that, you know, legislating UNDRIP and would in fact would ultimately do away with blockades and protests as opposed to spurring more of them.
Absolutely. It would create certainty in the way in which proponents and jurisdictions consider the landscape on any particular project. And ultimately, it also would get Indigenous peoples closer to participating and having a shared responsibility in resource extraction in this country.
Well, you've been able to make your points to us, and I know they're points you wanted to make with the First Ministers. And again, you may still get a chance, but there's always a lot of fanfare around these meetings, and the fact that this one's not going ahead. I know in the past you've suggested they don't always produce results anyway. So what exactly has been lost by not being able to have this meeting?
Well, the ability to have a conversation and to be able to present the Inuit position on this, on the issues that we were going to discuss. No matter what, having conversations is important. Some of the challenges in these meetings have been that people just talk past one another. It ends up that leadership talks about how great the things that they're doing in their jurisdiction for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And on the Indigenous side, there's the ability to speak directly to premiers and the Prime Minister about the ongoing challenges that we have. I'd love for these meetings to evolve, and so that we create shared priority areas and then pledge to work together to implement different interventions on shared priority areas. I know we're a long ways away from that, but that still is my hope. And I was going to bring that up today in the meeting.
Yeah, it's never a bad idea to keep talking, I guess.
Absolutely.
Natan, Obed, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.